What if you see a painting so cursed that people refuse to keep it in their homes, even though it was once one of the most popular decorative prints of its time? The story does not come from an ancient relic, a medieval grimoire, or a haunted artifact buried in the ground. Instead, it comes from something that seemed ordinary and innocent, simple mass-produced painting hanging on the walls of living rooms across Britain and Europe. Yet behind this ordinary image, a legend grew, one that turned a popular artwork into a symbol of misfortune and terror. This is the chilling tale of the crying boy. The paintings were created by Giovanni Bragolin, an Italian artist working in the 1950s. His real name was Bruno Amadeo, and he produced a series of portraits depicting children with solemn, tearful faces. They were not expensive original works, but mass-printed reproductions, affordable to working-class families who wanted to decorate their homes. At first glance, these paintings were sentimental, perhaps even touching children staring out with wide, sorrowful eyes, their faces streaked with tears. They were the kind of art that tugged at the heart, evoking sympathy or compassion. By the 1970s and 1980s, these prints had spread far beyond Italy. In Britain especially, they became a common sight. You could walk into countless homes and see the crying boy or one of its variations framed on the wall, next to family photographs or a mantel clock. For many, it was simply an inexpensive and emotional decoration. But over time, stories began to spread stories that connected these paintings with tragedy. The whispers turned into urban legend, and before long, the crying boy was no longer seen as sentimental art, but as something dangerous, even cursed. The legend truly took root in the early 1980s, when the British tabloid press began reporting on a strange pattern. Firefighters, investigating the aftermath of devastating house fires, noticed something peculiar, time and time again, among the ashes and ruins of destroyed homes. One object seemed to survive unharmed: the painting of the crying boy, entire rooms reduced to rubble. Furniture burned to cinders, yet the print of the crying child would often be found untouched, not even singed. At first, this seemed like a strange coincidence, but as more and more cases came to light, it began to look less like chance and more like something sinister. Imagine how unsettling that must have been. Families who had lost everything whose possessions, sometimes even loved ones, stood among the ruins, only to find the wide, teary eyes of the painting staring back at them from an untouched frame. It was as if the child in the picture had watched the disaster unfold and emerged without a scratch. To grieving families, this was no comfort. Instead, it was deeply disturbing. People began to whisper that the painting itself caused the fires, that it was cursed, and that keeping it in your home invited disaster. The story spread like wildfire, especially after The Sun, a major British tabloid, published an article in 1985 under the headline "Blazing Curse of the Crying Boy." The report claimed that dozens of homes across the UK had been destroyed by unexplained fires, and in almost every case, a print of the crying boy had been present. The article fueled panic, and soon thousands of readers believed the curse was real. Letters poured into newspapers, with people claiming their houses had burned down shortly after acquiring the painting. Fire brigades confirmed the strange survival of the pictures in certain blazes, adding fuel to the belief that the child's sad gaze was more than just a trick of paint. The legend of the curse took on a life of its own. Some said that the boy in the painting was an orphan who had watched his family die in a fire, and his spirit lived on in the prints, seeking vengeance. Others claimed the child was a gypsy boy whose family had cursed him and all those who possessed his image. Another version suggested that Bragolin himself had made a pact with the devil, sealing the boy's eternal sadness onto canvas, forever dooming anyone who brought the painting into their home. Each telling made the story darker, and the painting's reputation grew more sinister. What made the story more believable to ordinary people was the sheer number of homes that seemed to suffer the same fate. In small towns and quiet neighborhoods, neighbors would whisper about a family who lost their house in a blaze, only to later learn that they had owned the crying boy. Word spread quickly. If you had the painting in your home, you were at risk. People began taking them down, some throwing them away, others burning them in the hope of breaking the curse. Yet in a cruel twist, there were even rumors that destroying the painting brought bad luck, making owners feel trapped with their sorrowful child, staring down at them day after day. The sheer eeriness of the situation made the story hard to dismiss. It wasn't just one or two isolated cases, it was dozens, maybe even hundreds, all connected to the same image. Firefighters themselves became part of the legend. Some claimed they refused to have the painting in their homes, convinced it brought disaster. For ordinary families, this was enough to push the legend from rumor to accepted truth. After all, if the very people who fought the fires believed the story, then surely there must be something to it. The unsettling thing about the crying boy is how ordinary it looks. Unlike a grotesque mask, a haunted doll, or a medieval artifact, this was a mass-produced print from the mid-20th century. It hung in working-class homes, given as gifts, bought cheaply in shops, seen as sentimental rather than threatening. And yet, the curse turned something mundane into something horrifying. A painting meant to stir sympathy and compassion had become an object of fear. For many, the legend of the cursed painting was less about superstition and more about control. A house fire is a devastating and senseless tragedy. To link such a random event to a single object gave people a way to make sense of the chaos. If you could blame the painting, then perhaps you could avoid the disaster by getting rid of it. In this way, the story became both terrifying and comforting at the same time. It offered an explanation, even if it was a dark and irrational one. Still, the legend endured because it was more than just a coping mechanism, was backed by too many strange coincidences to ignore. Families swore that their houses went up in flames soon after hanging the painting. Fire brigades swore they found the prints intact among the ruins. Neighbors swore they knew of people cursed by it. With every retelling, the cursed reputation of the crying boy grew, and this is just the beginning of the strange and unsettling tale. The crying boy was not just a painting. It became a cultural phenomenon, a superstition wrapped in tragedy, and one of the strangest modern urban legends to grip Europe. And if you're fascinated by cursed objects and the strange stories behind them, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Belmoze so you don't miss the next part of this chilling story. The fear around the crying boy truly took hold in the early 1980s when stories of strange and devastating fires began to spread. At first, these were just whispers, the kind of tales you might hear from a neighbor or through word of mouth. But soon, national newspapers picked up the story, and what had been a local curiosity turned into a national obsession. The reports all carried the same disturbing detail. Houses reduced to rubble and ash, furniture burned beyond recognition, walls blackened and broken, but among the wreckage, one object would be left almost untouched. It wasn't a crucifix, a family photograph, or even an expensive heirloom. It was the print of the crying boy. No matter how intense the blaze, no matter how much the rest of the home was destroyed, the sad-eyed face of the child seemed to survive. The most famous of these reports came in 1985, when the Sun, a British tabloid with millions of readers, ran a sensational headline, "Blazing Curse of the Crying Boy." The story focused on Ron and Mayhall, a couple from Rotherham, South Yorkshire. Their home had gone up in flames, leaving them with nothing. Firefighters combed through the ashes, and there, among the wreckage, was a framed print of the crying boy. It was not just intact, it was completely unscathed. The couple, like many others, became convinced that the painting was cursed. What made the story even more disturbing was that the Halls were not alone. The Sun revealed that firefighters across the country were reporting similar findings. They claimed that time and again, in house fires where nothing else remained, a copy of the crying boy would be found in perfect condition. These were not isolated incidents. According to the reports, there were dozens of such cases, and soon, people began to panic. The public's imagination caught fire almost as quickly as the homes themselves. People began to ask how a cheap, mass-produced print could repeatedly survive fires that destroyed everything else. It seemed unnatural, even supernatural. Firefighters themselves gave interviews, some admitting that they had grown uneasy with the number of times they saw the painting among the ashes. They joked about refusing to keep the crying boy in their own homes, though beneath the humor was a very real unease. The bizarre phenomenon had a chilling psychological effect for families who had already lost everything. Finding the painting intact in the ruins felt like an insult, almost like a mocking presence. Survivors described the experience of seeing the child's tearful eyes staring back at them from the wreckage as deeply unsettling. Some believed that the boy was somehow connected to the fire, as though he had caused it and then stood silently watching the destruction. One story that circulated widely involved a woman in Merseyside whose home was gutted by fire. Like so many others, her crying boy print was found untouched. When asked about it afterward, she swore that she had been warned by friends to take the painting down, but had ignored the advice. After the fire, she blamed the painting entirely, claiming that it had brought disaster into her home. This kind of testimony, emotional and sincere, made the legend all the more convincing to the public. In another case, a pizza shop in the north of England burned down in a late-night blaze. Once again, among the debris was a crying boy print that had survived. The story made local headlines, adding yet another layer to the growing curse. People could dismiss one or two coincidences, but as the reports piled up, the curse began to feel like undeniable truth. Rumors fed into the mystery. Some claimed that attempts to destroy the painting brought even worse misfortune. Stories circulated of people who had tried to burn their prints, only to find that the flames would not touch them. Others claimed that those who successfully got rid of the painting met with accidents, bad luck, or further fires. It created a sense of being trapped to own the painting, and you risk fire, destroy it, and you risk something worse. The newspapers thrived on the fear. They printed more and more stories of fires linked to the crying boy, often accompanied by photographs of devastated homes with the intact painting at the center. Each report amplified the panic. Families rushed to rid their homes of the cursed artwork. Some threw them in bins, others donated them to charity shops, and some even tried to bury them. Charity workers began to refuse donations of the crying boy, claiming they wanted nothing to do with the curse. The hysteria reached a peak when the Sun invited readers to send their crying boy paintings to the newspaper's headquarters. Thousands of people mailed their prints in, desperate to get rid of them. The newspaper later staged a large bonfire to destroy the collection, promising that the curse would be broken once and for all. It became a public spectacle, a way for people to feel they had taken control of the fear that had gripped the country. But the destruction only deepened the legend. If the paintings really were cursed, would burning them release the curse or spread it further? Would the act of gathering so many in one place amplify their power? Questions like these fueled late-night conversations and gave the story even more weight. For every skeptic who dismissed the curse as nonsense, there were believers who swore that the paintings held some kind of dark energy. The persistence of the legend can also be explained by how strange the physical evidence seemed. Firefighters themselves admitted that they could not explain why the paintings so often survived when everything else was lost. Of course, there were rational explanations that the prints were coated in fire-retardant varnish, or that they were hung on walls where fires didn't burn as hot. But to many, these explanations felt too convenient. They preferred to believe that the crying boy was something more than just paint and paper. The 1980s were a fertile time for this kind of fear. Britain was going through economic hardship, and many working-class families who owned the prints were already struggling. When disaster struck, the idea of a cursed painting offered an explanation for tragedy, a way to direct anger and grief at something tangible. Instead of facing the randomness of fate, people could point to the sad eyes of the crying boy and say, "That's why it happened." Over time, the fires linked to the painting became more than just stories. They became a collective experience, a cultural memory. Even people who had never owned the painting began to fear it. Parents warned their children not to bring one home, and neighbors gossiped about who might still have one on their wall. The crying boy was no longer just a picture. It was a symbol of bad luck, a face that seemed to look out from the ruins of every disaster. The story spread far beyond the homes that burned. It became a national obsession, the kind of tale people swapped at pubs or around dinner tables. Everyone seemed to know someone who knew someone whose house had gone up in flames after hanging the painting. That is how legends grow through repetition, fear, and the need to find meaning in disaster. And as the fires continued, the legend of the crying boy only grew darker, cementing its place as one of the strangest and most terrifying urban legends of the late 20th century. The strange survival of the crying boy paintings led people to search for explanations beyond coincidence or science. After all, how many times could a cheap print make it through devastating fires without so much as a scorch mark before people began to think something darker was at play? The human mind struggles with random tragedy. It looks for patterns, for a cause, for something or someone to blame. In the case of the crying boy, the theories became darker and more unsettling as the legend grew. One of the most popular stories was that the boy depicted in the painting was not just a model or a made-up face. According to this theory, he was a real child who had died in a fire. People whispered that the artist had met this boy in an orphanage or on the streets of Italy and had captured his sadness on canvas. The legend claimed that the child's death was violent, his life cut short in flames, and that his restless spirit had become bound to the painting. Every copy of the print carried with it not just the image of grief, but the trapped, angry soul of a child who had never found peace. To those who believed, this explained everything. The boy had died in fire, so now he caused fire. The tears on his face were not just a symbol of sadness, but a warning, a reminder of the blaze that had consumed him. And when houses burned and the picture remained untouched, it was not because of varnish or luck, it was because the spirit within the painting refused to perish again. Survivors of house fires sometimes spoke about the eyes of the boy seeming alive, almost as though he had been watching as the flames rose. Some even claimed the boy's expression appeared different afterward. His sorrow deepened, his gaze more accusing. Another theory went further, claiming the boy himself had been cursed in life. Some said he had been abandoned by his family, wandering alone, and that misfortune followed him wherever he went. Any house that gave him shelter was said to end in tragedy. When he finally died in fire, that curse was locked inside the painting. To believers, the prints were not just unlucky, they were vessels of a child's misery and rage, doomed to spread misfortune wherever they were hung. But not all theories focused on the boy himself. Some people believed the painting was never about the child at all, but about something far more sinister. According to this darker line of thought, the crying boy portraits were not innocent works of art, but containers for a demonic presence. The idea was that the demon had attached itself to the artwork, hiding behind the sad face of the child. Where the painting hung, the demon was present, and where the demon was present, destruction followed. This theory gained traction because of one chilling detail: the paintings never burned. For those who believed in the supernatural, this was not a coincidence, but evidence. Fire was one of the oldest symbols of purification, a force that destroyed evil. Yet here was an object that fire could not touch. People asked, what kind of power could survive flames? The answer to them was something unholy. The demon protected the painting from fire, but it was also the one calling the fire into being. It fed on fear, chaos, and destruction, and in every blaze it thrived. In this view, the crying boy was simply a mask. The tear-streaked face made people pity it, made them lower their guard. But behind those innocent eyes was a presence that delighted in ruin. People spoke in hushed tones about the demon using the painting as a doorway away into the homes of ordinary families. Once inside, it would slowly bring misfortune, culminating in fire, the final act of terror. Survivors described feeling a sense of heaviness in their homes before the fires, as though the air itself was thick with sorrow. Some even claimed to hear faint sobbing at night, only to find the painting staring at them in the morning light. The demonic theory spread because it fit so neatly with the fear people already felt. It turned a strange coincidence into a cosmic battle of good and evil. Firefighters might have spoken of varnish and wall placement, but believers insisted those explanations were too neat. They argued that nothing natural could explain the sheer number of times the crying boy was left untouched when everything else was destroyed. To them, this was the mark of something supernatural, something malevolent. Adding to the fear were the stories that destroying the paintings only made things worse. If people tried to burn them, the flames would not take. If they succeeded in tearing or breaking them, disaster would soon follow. Accidents, illnesses, financial ruin, all of these were said to strike those who disrespected the painting. This gave strength to the idea that the crying boy was protected by a dark force, one that punished anyone who tried to escape its grip. There were even whispers about the painter himself, Giovanni Bragolin. Some claimed he had made a pact with the devil to achieve fame, and the crying boy was the result. In this telling, the tears on the boy's face were not of sorrow, but of eternal damnation, and every print carried a fragment of that cursed bargain. While no evidence supported these claims, they flourished in the climate of fear, giving the legend a deeper sense of dread. For families who believed in these theories, the choice was terrifying. Keep the painting, and you might invite fire into your home. Destroy it, and you risk the wrath of the spirit or demon within. It created a kind of psychological trap where fear itself became part of the curse. Even those who wanted to dismiss the stories often found themselves uneasy when faced with the painting essays. It was one thing to laugh about the curse in daylight, another thing entirely to look into the sad, unblinking face late at night, alone in a quiet house. The demonic theory, though more outlandish than the spirit of the boy, stuck in the public imagination because it explained what logic could not. It offered a reason why the paintings were not consumed by flames, and why they seemed to follow destruction wherever they went. It painted the crying boy not as a work of art, but as a weapon, a silent intruder waiting to bring misery to the families who hung it on their walls. And as the legend grew darker, the line between a tragic child's spirit and a demonic force blurred. Some said the boy himself had become the demon, twisted by anger and grief into something unrecognizable. Others claimed the demon had chosen the boy's image because it was disarming, a disguise that made people invited into their homes willingly. No matter which version people believed, the effect was the same. The crying boy was no longer just a sad portrait. It had become a symbol of fear, a reminder that evil could be hidden in the most ordinary of places, watching silently from the wall as families lived their lives, waiting for the moment to strike. For years, fear and rumor gave the crying boy paintings their cursed reputation, but eventually, experts stepped in to put the mystery to the test. What they uncovered stripped away much of the supernatural terror and revealed how simple science had fueled decades of ghost stories. It turned out that the fires, while tragic and destructive, had nothing to do with demons, spirits, or angry children at all. Notice something peculiar, but also consistent. Time after time, when the houses were reduced to ashes and rubble, the crying boy prints were found face down, charred only around the edges, or not at all. For a while, even firefighters admitted to being unsettled by this pattern. It seemed too strange to dismiss as pure chance, but when fire experts finally investigated, they discovered that the so-called curse was far less sinister than people imagined. The key lay in the construction of the prints. The crying boy paintings weren't painted with oil on delicate canvas, as many assumed. Instead, they were mass-produced reproductions printed onto a form of hide-and-seek. This hardboard was pressed under heat to make it dense and durable, which had the unintended effect of making it resistant to flames. It didn't feed the flames in the same way curtains, carpets, or wallpaper did. So, when a fire tore through a home, the crying boy print stood a much better chance of surviving simply because of what it was made from. But that wasn't the only factor. Investigators also noted the way the paintings were mounted. Most of these mass-produced prints were hung with a simple wire across the back. When a fire broke out, the heat would quickly burn through the string or the nail holding the wire. As a result, the painting often fell from the wall during the fire. Instead of hanging in open air where flames and smoke could consume it, the painting would land face down on the floor. This position was critical. Lying flat against the ground, the image of the crying boy was shielded from the flames by the hardboard itself. The backside of the print might char or blacken, but the face was often left untouched. In this position, oxygen couldn't easily reach the surface of the painting. Fire requires oxygen to spread, and by lying face down, the painting was essentially protecting itself from being consumed, the very thing that made the image appear cursed. Its eerie survival was nothing more than an accident of gravity and chemistry. To drive the point home, journalists and fire experts even conducted controlled tests. They took crying boy prints and exposed them directly to flames. True to their research, the prints proved surprisingly resistant. They didn't immediately burst into flames, and when they were dropped face down, they suffered little more than scorched edges. What had seemed like proof of the supernatural was now explained in terms of density, oxygen supply, and the quirks of how house fires spread. Once the explanation became public, many began to see how the legend had spiraled out of control. People had noticed in eerie pattern paintings surviving fire after fire and human imagination had filled in the blanks with ghosts and curses. But when you stripped away the storytelling, the survival of the prints was not mysterious at all. It was a combination of mass production, durable material, and unlucky coincidence. If the crying boy prints had been made of thinner wood or fragile canvas, they likely would have burned along with everything else, and no curse would have ever been spoken of. Still, the debunking didn't stop people from believing. For many, the idea of a rational explanation felt unsatisfying. It was easier, or perhaps more exciting, to believe that a sad child ghost or a hidden demon lurked behind the painting. Science could explain the hardboard, the wires, and the lack of oxygen. But it couldn't erase the fear that people felt when they looked into the boy's mournful eyes. In fact, some skeptics argued that the survival of the prince might still have fed superstition, even after the explanation was given. They asked, if it was only science, why did it always seem to be this painting in so many fires, in so many different homes? Why not any other cheap print of the time? Part of the answer lies in psychology. Once newspapers started reporting on the crying boy curse, people began noticing and remembering it in ways they wouldn't have otherwise. If a fire destroyed a house and a painting of flowers survived, no one cared. If a painting of a child in tears survived, and there was already a story in the paper calling it cursed, people linked the two events. It was confirmation bias. People saw what they expected to see, and every surviving crying boy print added fuel to the fire of rumor. Even firefighters, who had the best chance of seeing these things firsthand, weren't immune. Many admitted that while they knew the science, they still felt uneasy when they found one of the prints in the wreckage of a blaze. They had lived through enough tragedies to know how random and cruel fire could be, and perhaps part of them still wondered if something more was at work. That unease spread to the public, and even though rational explanations were printed in newspapers, the curse refused to die. The debunking also highlighted how urban legends gained strength. In the 1980s, tabloids thrived on stories like this strange, frightening tales that made people shiver as they read. A straightforward explanation about hardboard and wire didn't sell as many papers as the idea of a cursed child haunting homes across Britain. So while experts gave their findings, newspapers often played up the fear instead, emphasizing the strange survivals and downplaying the science. The story of a demonic curse was simply too good to give up. This is how the crying boy shifted from a simple piece of art into a cultural phenomenon. It was never about one explanation being truer than the other. It was about which story people chose to believe. On one side, there was science, dense materials, face-down falls, oxygen deprivation. On the other side, there was legend, a child's spirit trapped in paint, a demon hiding in plain sight, a cursed object spreading misery. And for many, the legend was far more compelling than the science. The debunking didn't erase the fear. It gave people an answer, yes, but it also reminded them of how fragile the line is between ordinary life and extraordinary terror. A piece of cheap hardboard and some chance positioning could be mistaken for proof of the supernatural. That was almost more unsettling than the idea of a curse. It meant that our own minds, hungry for stories, could take the random cruelty of fire and turn it into a legend that haunted households across a nation. Even after the scientific explanations stripped away much of the fear, the story of the crying boy paintings never really died. Instead, it took on a life of its own, becoming one of those enduring legends that refuses to fade. No matter how many rational answers are offered, people still whisper about the curse, still pass on the tale, and still hesitate to hang a copy of the painting on their wall. It's almost as though the legend has become stronger than the painting itself, a ghostly echo of superstition that outlives the facts. One reason the curse refused to die is because people wanted it to be true. A crying child staring out from a frame already evokes discomfort, but when you pair it with whispers of fire and destruction, it turns into something unforgettable. Once that story took hold, no amount of fire-resistant hardboard could erase it. For every person convinced by the scientific explanation, there was another who swore that no accident of material could account for so many eerie survivals. Human nature leans toward the mysterious. We prefer stories that make the world strange and frightening because they stick in our memory. The idea of a cursed painting is far more exciting to tell around a dinner table than the technicalities of combustion. It also helped that these prints were so common. By the 1980s, millions of copies of The Crying Boy had been sold, hanging in modest homes across the United Kingdom. That ubiquity meant that when tragedy struck a fire, a freak accident, some unlucky event, there was always a chance that one of these paintings was there to be noticed. Its presence was rarely the cause, but it was always the detail people clung to. The painting became a scapegoat, something to point to when chaos destroyed what felt safe. People don't like randomness, especially when it comes to tragedy. To believe that bad luck could come from a picture on the wall felt easier than admitting that disaster can strike without warning or reason. Even now, decades later, collectors and curious buyers trade in these prints with a mix of fascination and dread. Some treat them as cursed relics, refusing to bring them into their homes. Others buy them precisely for the thrill of it, daring fate to test whether the legend still holds power. Stories continue to circulate of people who hang the crying boy in their home, only to experience strange misfortunes: pipes bursting, appliances breaking, or, in the most dramatic retellings, fires breaking out again. None of it has ever been proven, but proof isn't what keeps a legend alive. Fear does. This is how folklore works in the modern world. In the Middle Ages, people spoke of cursed relics, witches, charms, or haunted castles. In the 20th century, we replaced those with mass-produced art prints and tabloid headlines. But the core remains the same: the human desire to explain the unexplainable with something supernatural. The crying boy paintings tapped into that instinct perfectly. They combined unsettling imagery with unexplained tragedy and a sense of helplessness. Firefighters could say it's just hardboard, scientists could test the materials. But none of that erased the feeling people got when they looked into the boy's tearful eyes. It was as if the painting dared you to doubt it, to bring it into your home and see what would happen. The persistence of the legend also speaks to how powerful media can be in shaping belief. The tabloids of the 1980s didn't just report on fires and paintings. They told stories that thrilled and terrified readers. The more bizarre the story, the more papers they sold. By branding the crying boy as cursed, they ensured that the painting would forever be associated with fear, even if the facts didn't support it. Once something is framed as cursed in the public imagination, it rarely escapes. From that point forward, every coincidence, every tragedy, every unexplained event connected to the painting was folded back into the legend, reinforcing it like layers of smoke staining the walls after a fire. And so, the crying boy became more than a painting. It became a cultural touchstone, a modern ghost story dressed up as art. Parents told their children about it, neighbors whispered warnings, and even today, internet forums and paranormal blogs still debate whether the curse is real. Some post photos of the prints they've found, half-jokingly daring others to claim them. Others share personal anecdotes of misfortunes that followed after buying one. Whether or not those events are coincidence doesn't matter. The legend has become self-sustaining, feeding on belief itself. What makes the crying boy's story so compelling is that it straddles the line between ordinary and supernatural so perfectly. On one hand, it's just a cheap print made in the millions. On the other, it's a supposed cursed object that terrified an entire country. That tension between rational and irrational, between science and superstition, is what gives the legend its lasting power. It makes us wonder, if this one painting could spark such fear, how many other everyday objects around us could hold secrets we haven't yet uncovered? At the end of the day, the crying boy paintings are a reminder that humans are storytellers at heart. We find patterns in chaos, we turn accidents into omens, and we pass those stories along until they become folklore. Whether cursed or not, the crying boy has achieved immortality not through fire or tragedy, but through the human imagination. It remains one of the strangest and most enduring urban legends of the modern age, a tale that still unsettles anyone who looks too long into those painted, tear-filled eyes. If you've made it this far into the story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe the crying boy paintings were truly cursed? Or do you think it was nothing more than a strange series of coincidences wrapped up in superstition? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed diving into this unsettling piece of folklore, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who love eerie mysteries, and subscribe to Belmoze for more chilling stories from the shadows of history.